23 pounds of stamped steel and aluminum sat on the mud-stained sandbags, barrels still warm from the morning's test fire. Bipod legs folded back along the barrel like a grasshopper at rest. The M60 machine gun looked almost peaceful in the filtered sunlight of Firebase Kate, 40 miles west of Pleiku in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam. It was 43.5 inches long. Its gas-operated mechanism could cycle 550 rounds per minute, feeding from a 100-round disintegrating link belt of 7.62mm NATO ammunition. The barrel was chrome-plated on the inside, a thin metal rod of precision engineering that could be swapped out in 10 seconds when overheated. The weapon had no buttstock in the traditional sense, just a hinge plate that folded down. No wooden furniture, just metal and function. It sat there on those sandbags like a piece of industrial machinery someone had forgotten to take back to the factory, which wasn't far from the truth. The M60 had been designed by the Inland Division of General Motors Corporation in the years after World War II, an attempt to take the best features of two German weapons, the MG-42's feed mechanism and the FG-42 paratroop rifle's operating system, and merge them into something American soldiers could carry into battle without needing a team of mules. It had been officially adopted in January 1957, 10 years before this particular morning at Firebase Kate. And in those 10 years, it had earned itself a nickname that every soldier in Vietnam knew: the Pig. Specialist for Victor Renza stood 15 feet away from the gun, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed off the platoon sergeant, watching 3 new replacements try to figure out how to clear a jam that didn't exist. The replacements had arrived the night before, fresh from Fort Lewis. Their uniforms still the right shade of green, their boots not yet molded to the shape of their feet. The tallest one, a kid named DeLong who couldn't have been more than 19, was holding the M60's feed cover open and staring into the receiver like it might contain the secrets of the universe. Renza took a drag on his cigarette and said nothing. 6 months ago, he'd been that kid. 6 months ago, he qualified as an expert with the M60 at Fort Lewis and thought that meant something. Now he knew better. Now he knew that qualifying as an expert with a machine gun in Washington State, firing at stationary targets on a range where nobody was shooting back, had approximately nothing to do with keeping that gun running in the Central Highlands when the North Vietnamese Army was trying to kill you. It was March 1967. Company B, 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, had been operating out of Firebase Kate for 3 weeks. The firebase was nothing fancy. A collection of sandbag bunkers and artillery pieces arranged in a rough circle, surrounded by concertina wire and claymore mines, carved out a jungle that wanted nothing more than to reclaim every square foot of clear ground. The company had 8 M60s, 2 per platoon. Renza had been carrying 2nd Platoon's No. 1 gun since October 1966, and in that time he'd learned things about the weapon that weren't in any manual. He'd learned that the M60 was both the most important weapon in the platoon and the most hated. He'd learned that machine gunners in Vietnam had a life expectancy measured in seconds once contact was made, because the enemy knew that if you killed the pig, you killed the squad's firepower. He'd learned that the weapon weighed 23 pounds, which sounded reasonable until you added 300 rounds of ammunition in belts draped across your chest, plus your ruck, plus your water, plus everything else you needed to survive in country, and then you were humping close to 70 pounds through jungle that fought you for every step. He'd learned that the M60 jammed when it got dirty, which was always, and that it jammed when it got too wet, which was also always, and that it had a safety switch that worked backwards from the M16 rifle, requiring an upward movement of the thumb to make the weapon ready to fire, which meant in the heat of combat, you could easily forget and try to fire a gun that was still unsafe. He'd learned that the barrel could cook off rounds if you fired too long without changing it, which meant keeping track of how many rounds you'd put through the gun while people were actively trying to kill you. He'd learned that the bipod legs were permanently attached to the muzzle, which made the gun muzzle heavy and awkward to carry. He'd learned that fire cartridge cases could tear during extraction, requiring you to stop and manually remove the mangled brass from the chamber, while incoming fire turned the air around you into a horizontal steel rain. But he'd also learned that when the M60 worked, when you cleaned it properly and loaded it correctly and mounted it solidly and squeezed the trigger with the right amount of pressure, it was the most devastating infantry weapon in the American arsenal. 550 rounds per minute. 9 rounds every second. Each round traveling at 2,800 feet per second. Fast enough to punch through tree trunks, through walls, through cover that looked solid but wasn't. The sound of the M60 firing was distinctive, a heavy rhythmic hammering that was slower and deeper than the high-pitched chatter of the M16, slower and more deliberate than the enemy's AK-47. When Renza fired number 1 gun, the enemy knew it. They could hear it. They could feel it. And if Renza was doing his job right, they could die from it. The problem, Renza thought, watching DeLong fumble with the feed cover, was that most soldiers in Vietnam treated the M60 like a curse. Squad leaders gave the pig to the newest guy, the most expendable soldier, because machine gunners attracted fire and machine gunners died first. It was cold-blooded mathematics. The enemy knew that the M60 was the source of American firepower, and so the enemy aimed at the M60 gunner before anyone else. Better to give the gun to a replacement who nobody knew yet, who nobody would mourn if he took a round to the skull in his first firefight. Renza had heard stories of platoons that went through 6 machine gunners in a month. 6 men, 6 funerals, 1 gun that kept getting passed from corpse to corpse like some kind of cursed inheritance. The brass at division headquarters said the M60 was a crew-served weapon requiring 3 men, gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition bearer. But in practice, that was a joke. In practice, the gunner carried a pig in 300 rounds and tried not to die. The assistant gunner, if you had one, carried more ammunition and tried to keep the belts feeding smoothly. The ammunition bearer, if you had one, and if he hadn't been reassigned to carry something else, humped extra barrels and prayed he didn't get promoted to gunner. It was a system that worked. Barely, because the M60 was just good enough to keep men alive despite its flaws. It was lighter than the old Browning M1919A for it replaced, lighter by 8 pounds, which didn't sound like much until you'd carry both through a rice paddy under fire. It had a faster rate of fire than the Browning, and the quick-change barrel meant you could keep shooting when the Browning would have melted itself into a useless lump of steel. But it wasn't faster than the enemy's weapons. The RPD light machine gun that the North Vietnamese carried fired at roughly the same rate, and the RPK that started showing up in late 1966 was just as deadly. More importantly, the RPD weighed 3 pounds less than the M60, and the RPK could use the same magazines as the AK-47, which meant the enemy machine gunner wasn't tied to belted ammunition that could tangle, jam, or break at the worst possible moment. The M60, for all its theoretical advantages, was a weapon designed by committee, built by the lowest bidder, and issued to soldiers who preferred something, anything, that didn't require a degree in mechanical engineering to keep running. The pistol grip was fragile. The trigger assembly was weak. The trigger sear could fail, causing the gun to run away, to keep firing even after you release a trigger, which was terrifying when you had 5 seconds worth of ammunition left and the gun was burning through it at 9 rounds per second. The bipod legs, permanently attached, got caught on vines and branches. The barrel latch lever was exposed, vulnerable to damage, prone to breaking at the worst possible time. The gas system, borrowed from the FG-42, was supposed to be elegant and efficient, but in the mud and humidity of Vietnam, it became just another thing that could fail. Cleaning the M60 was a full-time job. Keeping it running was an act of faith. And yet, when the bullets started flying, when the NVA came out of the jungle in their khaki uniforms and pith helmets, when the situation went from routine patrol to desperate firefight in the space of heartbeat, the M60 was a difference between holding a position and losing it. Renza had seen it happen. He'd seen enemy soldiers charge American position, seen them come in waves, seen them get cut down by long rolling bursts from the pig, seen the survivors break and run, because the sound of the M60 was enough to tell them that continuing the assault was suicide. The gun was heavy. The gun was unreliable. The gun was awkward and prone to failure. But when it worked like the hand of God reaching down to smite the wicked, and that was worth every pound it weighed and every hour spent cleaning it. Renza finished a cigarette and walked over to where DeLong was still trying to figure out the non-existent jam. "It's not jammed," Renza said. "You just don't know how to check it." He took the weapon from DeLong's hands, did a quick functions check, handed it back. "This is number 1 gun. I've been carrying it since October. It's killed at least 10 NVA that I know about, probably more that I don't. You're going to be carrying number 4 gun, which means you're new and expendable, and if you die, nobody's going to remember your name. That sound harsh? DeLong nodded, eyes wide. Good, Renza said. Harsh keeps you alive. This weapon weighs 23 pounds. You're going to carry it and 300 rounds of ammo, and you're going to clean it every single day, twice a day if we're in heavy contact. You're going to learn to change a barrel in under 10 seconds. You're going to learn to clear a jam in under 5. You're going to learn to fire short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds, because if you hold the trigger down, you're going to cook the barrel and waste ammo and give away your position. You're going to learn that the safety works backwards from your rifle. You're going to learn all this because if you don't, you're going to die, and worse, you're going to get other people killed. DeLong swallowed hard. Yes, specialist. Don't call me specialist. Call me Renza, and don't look so scared. The pig's going to save your life more times than you can count, if you learn to use it right. That conversation happened on March 21st, 1967. The next day, everything went to hell. It started like most operations in the Central Highlands. Early morning. Companies A and B moving through the jungle west of Firebase Kate, conducting a search and destroy mission along the Cambodian border. The jungle was triple canopy, thick enough that you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction, hot enough that your uniform was soaked with sweat within an hour. Company B was in a column, for platoon spread out, maintaining interval, trying to stay quiet even though staying quiet in the jungle was impossible. Every step cracked a twig, rustled a leaf, announced your presence to anyone listening. The companies were 700 yards apart, far enough to maneuver independently, close enough to support each other if things got ugly. At approximately 1,050 hours, Company A walked into an ambush. Renza heard it before he saw anything. The sudden eruption of automatic weapons fire, the deeper boom of RPGs, the sound of men shouting. Company B's commander immediately gave the order to move west, to reinforce a company, and the 4 platoons shifted from column into a line abreast, each platoon shoulder to shoulder with the next, moving through the jungle toward the sound of the guns. Renza hefted number 1 gun, checked that the safety was off, glanced at his assistant gunner specialist Paul Domke, and moved forward. The firing was getting louder. Company A was in heavy contact, pinned down by what sounded like a full NBA battalion. And now Company B was about to walk into the same mess. The North Vietnamese Army was not the Viet Cong. The VC were guerrillas, farmers by day and fighters by night, armed with whatever they could steal or scrounge. The NVA were professional soldiers, trained in China and Russia, equipped with modern weapons, organized into battalions and regiments, following military doctrine that emphasized overwhelming firepower and coordinated assault. Fighting the VC was dangerous. Fighting the NVA was terrifying. And somewhere ahead, through the trees, an NVA battalion was systematically destroying Company A. Company B kept moving. Renza could hear the fight now, close enough that individual weapons were distinguishable. The staccato crack of AK-47s, the slower thumping of RPDs, the occasional deep boom of an 82 millimeters mortar. Close enough that he could smell it, that distinctive odor of cordite and blood and fear that meant men were dying. Company B closed within 200 yards of Company A and ran into the NVA blocking force. The enemy had positioned themselves between the 2 companies, preventing reinforcement, and suddenly the jungle erupted in fire. Renza dove into a small dry stream bed, Domke right behind him. To his right were Sergeant Arthur Parker and Specialist 4 Joey Piambino, both from Fort Lewis, both friends. Renza set up number 1 gun on the lip of the stream bed, bipod legs extended, barrel pointing toward where the firing was coming from. He dropped back down to organize his ammunition, linking 200-round belts together, making sure the feed was clean. Then he popped back up to engage, and a bullet snapped past his right ear, so close he felt the heat of it. So close that if he'd moved his head an inch to the right, it would have punched through his skull and blown his brains across the stream bed. The round hit the tree next to him, bark exploding, and Renza dropped like a stone, pulling the gun down with him, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. An NVA soldier had seen the gun, had waited for Renza to show himself, had aimed and fired and missed by an inch, maybe less. Renza lay in the stream bed, breathing hard, hands shaking, knowing with absolute certainty that if he put his head up in the same place again, he would die. He crawled left, dragging number 1 gun and 200 rounds of belted ammunition, found a spot where the stream bed leveled off and opened fire. The M60 roared, that heavy rhythmic hammering that sounded like industrial machinery, and Renza watched the jungle in front of him disintegrate as the 7.62 millimeter rounds tore through leaves and branches and hopefully enemy soldiers. To his right, Piambino stuck his head up to fire his M16. An NVA round hit him in the forehead and blew out the back of his skull. Renza saw it happen. Saw his friend from Fort Lewis, the kid who sang doo-wop songs from Long Island, drop like a puppet with cut strings. The same soldier who'd shot at Renza. The same soldier who'd been waiting, patient, professional, deadly. Renza kept firing, kept the trigger down longer than he should have, burning through ammunition, knowing he was wasting rounds but not caring, needing to kill the man who'd killed his friend. The barrel of number 1 gun was smoking now, hot enough to cook off rounds if he didn't stop, but he couldn't stop. Domke was screaming at him to ease off, and Renza finally released the trigger, the sudden silence almost as loud as the firing had been. Company B couldn't reach Company A. The NVA blocking force was too strong, too well positioned. The company commander, Captain Robert Shawley, pulled the unit back, formed a defensive perimeter, called an air support. 4 Phantom jets screamed overhead, dropping canisters of napalm that tumbled end over end before exploding in white-hot fireballs that rolled across the jungle like the wrath of God. The napalm burned everything. Trees, underbrush, enemy soldiers. Burned so hot that Renza could feel the heat from 200 yards away. The NVA fire slackened, then stopped. The enemy was dead, driven off, or smart enough to retreat before the next airstrike turned them into charcoal. Shawley called Renza's name. Renza picked up number 1 gun and walked to the center of the perimeter, where the captain stood with platoon Sergeant Bruce Grandstaff and Sergeant Bob Sanzone. 4th Platoon's machine gun crew had been killed in the fighting, Shawley explained, and Renza was being transferred to 4th Platoon to replace them. Renza wanted to protest. 2nd Platoon's number 2 gun crew, Rinaldo and May, his friends, would be left without support. But orders were orders, and Grandstaff was standing right there. And Grandstaff was the kind of sergeant who led from the front and expected everyone to follow him into hell if necessary. Renza nodded. He understood. He picked up his gear and moved to 4th Platoon's sector of the perimeter. Company B had 7 dead. Company A had 22. 29 American soldiers killed in a single engagement with an enemy that outnumbered them, outmaneuvered them, and came within a hair's breadth of overrunning both companies completely. Renza helped carry the bodies out. The napalm had burned some of them, left them blackened and smoking. The smell something he knew he would never forget no matter how long he lived. For the next 3 weeks, Company B operated out of Firebase Kate, without major contact. Patrols went out. Patrols came back. The jungle stayed quiet, which was somehow worse than when it was loud. In mid-April, Renza went to Captain Shawley and asked for a replacement gunner. He'd been carrying an M60 for 7 months. 7 months of humping 23 pounds plus ammunition through jungle and rice paddies. 7 months of sleeping with the gun, cleaning the gun, firing the gun, depending on the gun for survival. 7 months of being the most visible target in every firefight. He wanted a break. He wanted to carry an M16 rifle, which weighed 7 pounds and felt like a feather by comparison. Shawley agreed. The next replacement to arrive would take over number 1 gun. Renza would finally be done with the pig. Private First Class Joe DeLong arrived in late April. 19 years old, fresh from training, the kid Renza had shown how to clear a non-existent jam back in March. Shawley assigned DeLong to 4th Platoon as a new M60 gunner. Renza spent 3 days teaching him everything he knew: how to fire short bursts, how to change the barrel, how to clear jams, how to keep the weapon clean, how to love the gun and hate the gun in equal measure. DeLong was a fast learner. He was strong enough to carry the weight. He was scared, but everyone was scared. On May 17, 1967, DeLong officially took over 4th Platoon's number 1 gun. Renza slung an M16 over his shoulder and felt like he could fly. The next day, 4th Platoon walked into an ambush. It started with 3 NVA soldiers on a trail near the Cambodian border. Company B's point squad spotted them, tried to capture them, but the enemy soldiers ran. 4th Platoon was sent to recon the trail to the west, while 1st Platoon went east-southeast. Standard procedure: move forward, find the enemy, report back. 4th Platoon moved 200 yards down the trail and ran into an NVA battalion. The jungle exploded. Renza hit the ground, rolled behind a log, looked for cover that didn't exist. The NVA were everywhere, firing from concealed positions, coordinating their fire. Professional soldiers executing a textbook ambush. 4th Platoon, 30 men, was surrounded by 300 enemy troops. Renza fired his M16 short controlled bursts, aiming at muzzle flashes because he couldn't see actual targets. He could hear the M60 firing somewhere ahead of him. Number 1 gun, DeLong's gun now, but he couldn't see it, couldn't tell if DeLong was okay. The platoon tried to form a defensive perimeter, but the NVA kept pushing, kept firing, kept closing the noose. At 1,500 hours, Sergeant Grandstaff made the hardest decision any combat leader can make. He called artillery fired directly onto 4th Platoon's position. Better to risk friendly casualties from artillery than guarantee total annihilation from enemy assault. 155mm howitzer shells screamed down from Firebase Kate, landing in and around a tiny platoon perimeter, tearing trees out by their roots, throwing shrapnel in every direction, killing friend and foe alike. It was chaos. It was hell. And it wasn't enough. After the artillery stopped, the NVA swept to the platoon position and executed survivors. Renza, lying behind his log with 2 other soldiers, watched 4 enemy soldiers walk through the branches of a downed tree just feet away. One of them looked in Renza's direction, raised his AK-47, fired 6 times. 2 rounds hit the log above Renza's head, close enough that splinters cut his face. Then the NVA soldiers walked away, sat down 20 yards distant, ate lunch like they were on a picnic. After 30 minutes, they left. Renza stayed frozen behind the log, waiting, listening, wondering if he was the only one alive. Company A found 4th Platoon the next morning. Of the 30 men in the platoon, 21 were dead. 1 was missing. 8 were alive, 7 of them wounded. The missing soldier was Private First Class Joe DeLong. The NVA had captured him and taken him to a prisoner of war camp in Cambodia. DeLong would die later that year, killed attempting to escape. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. And number 1 gun, Renza's gun, the weapon he'd carried for 7 months, the weapon that saved his life more times than he could count, was gone, captured, taken by the enemy. Renza never saw it again. The Army sent him home in June 1967. Purple Heart for wounds received, honorable discharge, back to Peekskill, New York. He went back to cutting hair, the job he'd had before the draft. He worked in New York City for a while, at Kenna's Salon, working with models and fashion editors, even doing Jackie Kennedy's hairpieces. In 1973, he opened his own salon in Peekskill. He retired in 2012. He never talked about Vietnam, never told his clients about number 1 gun or Joe DeLong or the day he came within an inch of dying in a stream bed in the Central Highlands. People asked sometimes if he'd been in the war. He'd say yes, change the subject, move on. But sometimes, standing in a salon on a quiet afternoon, scissors in hand, the familiar way his tools comfortable after decades of practice, he'd hear something. A car backfiring, a construction worker's jackhammer, some sharp rhythmic sound. And for just a moment he'd be back in that stream bed, 23 years old, fingers wrapped around the grips of an M60 machine gun, watching tracers arc across the jungle. He'd remember the weight of the gun, the smell of cordite, the sound of the barrel cooking off rounds. He'd remember Piambino and DeLong and all the others who didn't come home. He'd remember that for 7 months his life had depended on a weapon that everyone called the pig, a gun designed by committee, built by the lowest bidder, hated by the men who carried it, and loved by the men who survived because of it. The M60 was replaced in U.S. military service by the Belgian FNMAG in 1997, 40 years after it was adopted. 40 years of honorable, if controversial, service. But the gun never really went away. The Navy still uses them. The Coast Guard still uses them. Countries all over the world still order M60s, especially the improved E4 model, because despite all its flaws, despite all the complaints, despite the nickname that suggested it was fat and clumsy and awkward, the M60 did what it was supposed to do. It put overwhelming firepower in the hands of infantry soldiers who needed it. It killed the enemy. It kept Americans alive. It wasn't perfect. But in the brutal mathematics of combat, perfect is the enemy of good enough, and the M60 was good enough. Victor Renza died in Florida in 2020, age 75, a hairdresser who'd once been a machine gunner, a man who'd carried number 1 gun to the Central Highlands and lived to talk about it, though he rarely did. He never knew what happened to his gun, never knew if the NVA used it against other Americans, or if it was lost on some forgotten battlefield, or if it's sitting in a museum in Hanoi right now, a war trophy from a conflict that killed 3 million people and changed nothing and everything. He never went looking for it. Maybe he didn't want to know, but he remembered it. Every day. The weight of it. The sound of it. The way it felt when it was firing. That steady rhythmic hammering that meant he was still alive and the enemy was dying. He remembered teaching Joe DeLong how to use it. Remembered thinking the kid would be fine. Remembered being wrong. He remembered that the life expectancy of a machine gunner in Vietnam was 7 seconds from the moment of first contact, and that he'd beaten those odds for 7 months, and that DeLong hadn't even made it 7 days. They called it the Pig. 23 pounds of stamped steel and aluminum, gas-operated, belt-fed, air-cooled, firing 7.62 millimeter NATO ammunition at 550 rounds per minute. It was heavy. It was awkward. It jammed when it got dirty, and it got dirty every single day. But when it worked, when you cleaned it right and loaded it right and set it up right and squeezed the trigger with just the right amount of pressure, it was a hand of God reaching down to smite the enemy, and that was worth everything. That was worth the wait and the jamming, and the nickname, that was worth surviving. That was worth remembering. 50 years later, in a salon in Peekskill, scissors in hand, an old man thinking about a young man, and a gun called number 1.